The truth rarely arrives loudly, but it never leaves quietly. To some, he was the voice that opened an entirely new universe. To others, he was the hand that nudged the first stones, shaking the foundations of long-entrenched doctrine. He lived in a Europe drawn tight beneath the weight of war heresy and restless ambition. Ancient libraries guarded the knowledge of centuries, yet the newly born telescope had already begun to unveil something the old texts could no longer conceal. The sky was not immutable. At the heart of this shifting world lay a quiet tragedy. Nights spent tracing the paths of wandering stars. Friendships that thinned as his ideas brushed against forbidden borders. And the cost a single person must pay when he dares to walk ahead of his own age. In the end, the very man who widened the heavens was forced to narrow his steps. The universe he revealed kept expanding, even as his own world narrowed to a single room. If you are listening at night, let your shoulders soften a little. Draw a slow breath. Let this story drift toward you like the faint light of a newly risen star. Before we begin, if you wish for journeys like this to keep finding their way to you, leave a small sign, a quiet subscription, a gentle word. Just a simple gesture, yet it helps this story reach those who might need it. Now we walk into the place where knowledge meets destiny. Settle in as we begin to explore the life of Galileo Galilei. This is the bedtime biography of a man who refused to stop looking. Chapter 1. The Stone House and the First Light. Morning in Pisa often began with a pale mist settling over the worn walls of its narrow streets. That light slipped through the smallest cracks in the shutters and came to rest on the wooden table inside a stone house near the river. The air carried the salt of a distant sea and the echo of church bells drifting from the central square. It was there that a child was born on the 15th of February in the year 1564. A child no one in the city could yet imagine would later alter the way humankind looked at the sky. On a cradle placed by the window, the morning light fell in a slow diagonal. Outside lay a city of merchants and scholars. Inside, the Galilei family moved with careful steps, keeping the house still for their firstborn. They belonged to the educated middle class of Florence, not wealthy, but shaped by learning. Their lineage had once included officials and lawyers. Yet, by the time of Vincenzo Galilei, their fortunes were no longer secure. He earned his living as a musician and teacher, and he had taken part in spirited debates on the nature of musical theory. His income rose and fell, forcing the family to measure every expense, especially as more children arrived in the years ahead. Vincenzo believed sound could be weighed by ratios and numbers. He tested strings, measured their lengths, listened to their trembling, and wrote down what he found. In that household, science was not an abstract word. It unfolded on the dinner table. Simple wooden tools, strings stretched across makeshift frames to test their resonance. Small conversations about harmony and proportion. Together they formed an atmosphere that would later be recognized as the earliest foundation of a child's experimental mind. Few stories survive from those early years. Yet one truth stands firm. Pisa was a city always in motion. Ships heavy with salt glided slowly through the harbor. Students from across the region came to study at Tuscany's oldest university. Debates on science and philosophy flared in small taverns along the river bank. A boy growing up among these sounds learned a simple habit. He touched things to know their shape. He looked at them for a long time, not with imagination, with patient observation. Years later, people recalled that he displayed an unusual steadiness even as a child. While others played in the courtyard, he would sit by the window watching the afternoon light slide across the stone floor. No one knew what he was thinking. Perhaps he was not thinking at all, only watching, only receiving, allowing the world to reveal itself through the tiniest changes that only the very slow can see. When the family moved to Florence around 1574, he carried that quietness into a larger city. Florence was past the golden age of its master painters, yet still breathed as a center of learning. Gray stone buildings, narrow lanes opening into bright squares. The Medici are tightening their hold on power. And in the midst of all that motion was a 10-year-old boy who kept the habit of sitting at the window each evening to watch a streak of light climb the wall across the street. His family sent him to the monastery of Vallombrosa, a silent place in the mountains. No city noise, only bells and the wind moving through long stone corridors. For some, it would feel confining. For him, it became a vast room where every motion sharpened into clarity. Light gliding over the floor, a monk's robe shifting with the breeze. The straight lines of hallways stretched forward as if drawing his gaze toward some distant point. No one knows precisely what touched him during those years. Yet many accounts suggest he once considered a life in the church. Perhaps he was drawn to the silence. Perhaps he sensed there a discipline and order he would later bring into every observation. Each step in the monastery felt like an experiment in light. Each toll of the bell is like a pendulum striking the air. These small details would shape the way he approached the world, not through conjecture, through the measure of time and movement. Looking back at his childhood, people have found no dramatic tales, no upheavals, no grand declarations, only a steady current. A child raised between the music of his father and the discipline of the monastery, between the sound of the Arno and the wind in Vallombrosa. And between those two worlds, a character quietly forms, one that lingered longer than most. One who understands truth often hides in the smallest motions. In the afternoons, the light still traveled across the stone floor like a slow brush stroke. Within it was the silhouette of a boy observing what others never paused to see. One day, they would call him Galileo. The light faded. The room returned to its original stillness. A life always begins with a moment like that. Very small, very slow, yet enough to open an entire universe. Chapter 2. The Silent Corridors of Vallombrosa. In the year 1574, Florence was entering a new phase under the rule of the Medici. Administrative reforms, building projects, and the widening reach of their political power turned the city into a gathering place for merchants, artists, and scholars. That same year, the Galilei family left Pisa and settled there. A learned, middle-class household sustained by music, they needed a steadier foundation to raise their growing number of children. The move unfolded quietly, yet marked the first step that would take young Galileo away from the city of his birth. Vallombrosa in the 16th century appeared as a modest cluster of stone edifices shaped from gray sandstone, weathered by time. Its red roofs rested beneath a veil of morning mist, and the thick walls held the night's chill, even when the sun stood high. The forest air of the Apennines carried the scent of pine resin, damp earth, and the soft rustle of leaves brushing against one another in wavering winds. Daylight slipped through narrow windows and fell onto the stone floors in thin, measured bands that shifted color with each passing hour. It was a quiet light, imbued with the spirit of the hilltop monasteries that had watched over Tuscany for centuries. Within this setting, the monastery became his new refuge. Vallombrosa lay on the eastern slopes above Florence, surrounded by tall trees and the cool, moist air of the mountains. Each morning, a fine layer of mist settled on the brick courtyard like the breath of winter. Monks moved slowly along the corridors, their heavy robes steeped in moisture, and their footsteps rang with such clarity that one could hear even the smallest change in a walker's rhythm. Galileo entered this rhythm with a natural ease. Neither shy nor restless, he belonged to the quiet art of watching. He listened to how sound returned from the stone walls. He watched leaves fall in soft spirals as the breeze crossed the cloister. He noticed how each bell shifted its tone slightly with the weather. These were not lessons taught in any classroom. Yet they formed the groundwork of a habit of tracking motion, a habit he would one day use to describe inertia and oscillation. Education at Vallombrosa revolved around Latin prayer and disciplined routine. Every activity followed a fixed hour. This constancy stretched time into long, unbroken strands. In such a place, every small detail stood out more clearly because nothing rushed past. Galileo grew within that space. A knock at a door or the brush of fabric against stone could become a point of focus, something to hold and remember. Beyond those stone walls, Tuscany was shifting in its own way. Florence in those years throbbed with the wheels of merchants' carts and the debates of scholars. New workshops rose along the Arno weaving houses, printing shops and long rows of dwellings built for a city whose vigor grew by the season. The outer world moved quickly, while his own world drifted at the pace of a pendulum, one he would later measure with remarkable precision. That separation did not distance him. It created a ground from which he could sense the smallest change in the world around him. One afternoon he sat in the inner courtyard, watching how dampness spread across the stone after a morning fog. It was not the moving beam of light he had followed in Pisa. It was the gradual darkening of stone as moisture settled and then slowly retreated. The shapes had no symmetry, no clear rule. Yet their motion was soft, almost alive. He watched until every patch of dampness had faded. By the late 1570s, Vincenzo Galilei decided to bring his son back to Florence so he could study at a school outside the monastery. Middle-class families increasingly favored broader instruction in mathematics, grammar, and subjects that prepared children for university. The monastery, though rich in discipline and foundation, no longer fit the family's long-term plans. Leaving Vallombrosa thus became a turning point, a passage from the enclosed world of religious education to the growing urban landscape of Florence. Summer in the Apennines often began with cold mornings, mist pooling over red roofs, and light slanting in from the eastern valley. From that vantage point, the road to Florence opened downward into the plains, where the city expanded year by year. And from the contrast between these two worlds, Vallombrosa with its slow pulse and Florence with its restless motion, the next chapter of Galileo's life began to rise. Some corridors follow a person through an entire lifetime, even when their shapes are no longer clearly remembered. One wonders if he sensed that those quiet steps in Vallombrosa would one day carry him toward lecture halls, nights of experiment, and another kind of light, brighter than anything the mountains had ever shown him. Chapter 3. The student who stepped away from the path laid out for him. At the University of Pisa, in the late 16th century mornings, in the lecture halls, began with the soft chatter of students gathered from across Tuscany. Among them was a young man from Florence, the son of a musician carrying the familiar hopes of many middle-class families. Study medicine, earn a degree, secure a respectable place in society. It was a path considered reasonable and safe, and in those years it seemed the most reliable route into the educated ranks. Pisa at that time was an old center of learning. Stone corridors, professors reading from Latin texts, and a curriculum shaped strongly by Aristotle. A medical student did not study anatomy or pharmacology alone. He studied logic, mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy, absorbing the classical framework through which the world had long been interpreted. The city still bore traces of its former power as a proud republic. Stone streets along the Arno carried the voices of merchants and the clatter of boats arriving with goods from Lucca and Livorno. On the river's bridges, students paused to watch the water shift its color under the afternoon light. The intellectual life of Pisa mingled easily with the life of the streets. Church bells, craftsmen's tools, and brief debates rising in taverns near the university. For the young, it created a backdrop in which those searching for their own direction could feel the stirrings of a changing age, even when they had no idea where their futures would lead. Into this world, Galileo entered with every intention of following the path his father desired. Yet in Pisa, a small encounter altered everything. Ostilio Ricci, a teacher devoted to geometry and a friend of the Galilei family, introduced him to the opening pages of Euclid. It was not a grand lecture, only a quiet lesson in which Ricci drew lines and triangles on the board as he explained a few foundational propositions. Mathematics held no central place in medical training. But Ricci believed geometry allowed the mind to see truth through order and structure. Galileo was captivated by the way geometry rebuilt the world. Everything could be proven step by step through reasoning. No appeals to authority, no reliance on inherited certainty. only thought and the precise placement of lines. In the intellectual climate of the era, this view was unusual, though not isolated. A few young scholars were beginning to search for an escape from Aristotelian doctrine through measurement and mathematical argument. Still, the medical curriculum in Pisa remained heavy with scholastic tradition. Its lectures shifted little across centuries and offered few openings for new methods. Students drawn to mathematics often felt adrift if their families did not support the inclination. Galileo found himself in that position. He did not renounce medicine yet. He could not ignore the pull of geometry that Ricci had revealed. Here for the first time, two roads parted before him. One aligned with expectation. One aligned with the nature of his own mind. Between 1583 and 1584, Galileo began attending mathematical lectures more closely. He read texts circulating from Venice and spent more hours with Euclid than with the required lessons in medicine. Some teachers noticed not from any rebellion on his part, but from the questions he began asking. Questions about the structure of arguments rather than the content of medical theories. It was clear his mind was already turning. In 1585, Galileo left the University of Pisa without a degree. In the 16th century, this was not rare, especially for students who drifted from the course their families had planned. Yet for him it was a true turning point. For the first time, he stepped away from the path prescribed for him and accepted an uncertain future in order to follow what stirred his curiosity. Geometry, mechanics, and the order of the natural world. Afternoon winds from the Arno often slipped into the lecture halls, stirring the thin curtains by the windows. In that shifting light, the boundary between a path already drawn and a new one just beginning may have appeared clearer than any lesson recited aloud. It was here in the very city of his birth that Galileo paused before two directions and chose the one few expected. The intellectual world of Italy at the end of the 16th century was undergoing its own slow, resilient transformation. In Venice, reprints of ancient Greek works emerged with higher quality, accelerating the spread of knowledge. In Bologna and Padua, mathematicians began using measurement to study mechanics, placing experimentation above the repetition of classical claims. Even in Florence, the Medici's new printing houses made books easier to copy and circulate. For a mind opening as quickly as Galileo's, this landscape felt like a vast doorway easing itself open. No one knew what waited beyond it. But many young thinkers sensed that the old order was developing small fractures, places where new questions could slip in. One day in Florence, a small wooden table and a simple rolling ball would become the tools that carried him down that new path to its very end. Chapter 4. The Years of Self-Study. Among a wooden table and a rolling sphere. Across the surface of an old wooden table, morning light slipped in a thin, unwavering line. The wood was no longer perfectly flat. It had bowed slightly with age, creating a barely perceptible incline. On tables like this in Florence, at the end of the 1580s, many young men learned to observe the world with the simplest tools. For Galileo, That wooden table became the temporary stage of a fragile yet decisive chapter, his first years of self-study. After leaving Pisa without a degree, he returned to Florence at a moment when his family needed a steadier income. Vincenzo Galilei continued his life in music, but earnings from performance and composition rose and fell unpredictably. The older children were approaching the age of apprenticeships, and the younger ones still needed care. Galileo took on tutoring to help support the household. It was modest work, yet it offered what no university could. Time to watch, time to think, time to experiment. Florence remained one of Italy's great centers of art and craft. Workshops kept their doors open long after sunset. Near Santa Croce, the rhythmic tapping of hammers on weaving frames sounded almost like an early machine. Other neighborhoods smelled of chemicals used in mixing pigments for painters. The light of the city glancing off red rooftops and the slow curve of the Arno gave Florence the feeling of a place leaning toward a new age of knowledge, even as it still carried the textures of the medieval world. In that atmosphere, Galileo began writing his first notes on mechanics. Not full treatises, but scattered observations, experiments with motion and time. He set up inclined planes, placed small spheres upon them, and recorded how they gained or lost speed depending on the slope. In that era, precise timekeeping devices did not yet exist for scientific work, so many methods relied on repetition to reveal patterns. This suited him well. Observe with the eye measure through recurring rhythm record with patience. Small sketches that survive hint at his early fascination. Objects did not fall or roll in simple arcs, he noticed, but with a kind of acceleration. His tools were humble, yet his search for regularity in minute movements showed a mind already stepping far beyond the Aristotelian claim that heavy objects fall faster by nature. The idea forming in him was different. Motion must be described by measurement rather than intuition. On many afternoons, Florence sank into a soft, muted glow as the sun tilted behind the rooftops. From high windows, the dust in the air floated into view, suspended and drifting. City and study blurred together in those hours, a world in motion and a young man trying to understand motion through number. Tutoring took Galileo into many middle-class homes. Each one shaped the hours differently, some flooded with light, others dim. Some with desks beside narrow windows, others lit by a single oil lamp. No records detail exactly whom he taught or when. Yet scholars agree that he spent these years teaching mathematics and the rudiments of mechanics to younger students, while sharpening his own thinking through the act of explanation. These were also the years when Florence began to feel the stirrings of scientific exchange coming from the northern cities. Venice became a crossroads for newly printed books and manuscripts. Translations of Archimedes and mechanical notes from scholars in the Veneto made their way into Tuscany through trade routes and merchant ships. Not everyone could access them yet. Even fragments of this knowledge created an environment in which young mathematicians sensed they belonged to something larger than their own workshops and rooms. Among the topics that drew Galileo's attention were problems of centers of gravity levers and uniform motion subjects. Italians saw as bridges between art and science. Architecture, military engineering, and machinery all depended on mechanics. 16th century Italy did not separate these worlds. Mathematics served artisans as much as scholars. A young man teaching himself mechanics was not an anomaly. He was part of a rising current that would shape the foundations of modern science. Some accounts say he used small metal spheres to test inclines. Others describe him observing objects dropped from different heights. The details vary, but the purpose remained constant to find a consistent description of motion. All of this took place in modest surroundings, a small room, a few simple tools, and a city shifting gradually from art to experimental science. By the late 1580s, Galileo was becoming known in small academic circles through private lessons and conversations on mechanics. Scholars in Pisa and Florence began hearing of his talent, though he had published nothing yet. These early signals did not bring immediate fame, but they opened a passage toward the scholarly world he would soon re-enter as a teacher. And as that path emerged, the little wooden table, the place where he tested his earliest motions, held something of those years within it. Quiet, steady, and filled with an unanswered question about the order of the universe. The afternoon light tilted slowly away. Somewhere in Florence, another future was beginning to unfold. Chapter 5. A young man confronts the shadow of tradition. The gatekeepers of the University of Pisa often remarked that young professors arrived at the lecture halls at dawn with a hurried stride, for the stone corridors held the nights cold long after sunrise. Among those familiar figures was one noticeably younger than the rest, walking lightly yet steadily, carrying a thin bundle of manuscripts. It was Galileo returning to the place he had once left, without a degree, now standing in an entirely different role as professor of mathematics. His appointment in 1589 was not unusual. Italian universities often hired those who demonstrated clear teaching ability, even if they had not completed every formal requirement. Yet Galileo's presence here, teaching in the very city where he had abandoned the medical path, held a meaning that reached beyond the ordinary. Pisa still upheld a curriculum deeply rooted in Aristotle, a system-wide and enduring backbone of European thought for centuries. Every debate, every interpretation of the natural world circled back to that framework, as though it were the only ground on which understanding could be built. The lecture hall, where he taught mathematics, held row upon row of worn wooden benches. Tabletops were scratched by generations of students. On the walls hung copies of astronomical charts and the symbolic diagrams of scholastic tradition. The air carried that particular solemnity of a room, where knowledge had been preserved more than transformed. Yet within this stability lay its limits. Natural philosophy remained bound to Aristotle, and any question straying beyond his categories quickly became unwelcome. With his growing foundation in mathematics, Galileo saw the thin seams in this older method. His own observations, rolling spheres, inclined planes, paths of motion, did not align cleanly with Aristotle's descriptions. Rather than confront the system outright, he chose to teach through example, through measurement, through the steady logic of number. It was not open rebellion, but a way of teaching that led students to ask their own questions about what they had been told since childhood. In Italian universities of the late 16th century, such questions were not always received kindly. Many senior professors viewed geometry and measurement merely as auxiliary tools, never as replacements for the natural philosophy tested by time. Yet a younger generation, shaped by the spread of new ideas from Venice, Padua, and Bologna, was beginning to believe that the world must be described by measure rather than inherent nature. Galileo stood between the two worlds, young enough to step into a new age, knowledgeable enough to see the boundaries of the old. The years in Pisa are also remembered for his lecture notes, some of which describe how he explained falling motion not by recitation, but by geometric reasoning. Surviving manuscripts show his attempts to prove that speed in a fall could not depend simply on mass, as Aristotle claimed. These were not public experiments, but woven quietly into lessons, yet they still drew the notice of senior scholars, and not in admiration. Any deviation from tradition risked friction. There is no evidence that Galileo faced discipline, yet many accounts describe strained relations with the Aristotelian professors. Not from personal conflict, but from the deeper discomfort caused by his method. Measurement geometric argument approaches that unsettled the stability of an inherited system. In a place where Aristotle formed the bedrock, Galileo's questions alone were enough to create distance. By the end of the 1580s, Pisa was no longer the brightest center of scholarship. Northern universities, especially Padua, had become destinations for those eager to test new methods in natural science. News of these developments traveled through merchants and correspondents to Tuscany, stirring in many students and scholars a sense that the age was shifting faster than the old lecture halls could follow. In Pisa, Galileo increasingly felt the limits of the academic world in which he taught. Something within him seemed to move quietly forward. He needed a place where mathematics and mechanics could grow, without the constraint of inherited explanation. When word of an open position in Padua reached Tuscany, that opportunity appeared as a natural step in the movement of the age, a broader field, where the methods he was shaping might finally find room to stand. Late afternoon, Pisa still held its quiet tone. Wind from the Arno drifted through the stone corridors, and the evening light deepened the color of the plastered walls. Small details yet, they mirrored two diverging paths. One clung to the old structure, one pointed north toward new instruments, new theories, new ways of asking. No one knows what Galileo saw in the moment he chose to leave Pisa, but the manuscripts from the following years reveal what became clear to him. Questions of motion, free fall, and inertia no longer occupied the margins of his notes. They moved to the center, and from the lecture hall where Aristotle had cast the largest shadow, Galileo departed, carrying not only a bundle of pages, but a method in the making, a method that would reshape how humanity sees the natural world. The afternoon light from the lecture hall window fell across the wooden desk, thin as the last breath of an old room. That image closed his years in Pisa just before the road north opened, with a different kind of light. Chapter 6. Padua. A place where ideas could breathe. In 1592, Padua stood among the freest centers of learning in Europe. Under the protection of the Venetian Republic, the city maintained an intellectual climate far less bound by doctrine than Florence or Pisa. Students from Germany, France, Poland, and England crowded the stone streets leading to the university. They came for a single reason: to study in a place where knowledge was not confined by the hand of any authority. This was the world Galileo entered when he accepted the invitation to teach mathematics there. Padua, at the end of the 16th century, held the beauty of a city both ancient and open. Arched buildings, long corridors, and tiered windows carried echoes of Roman tradition, while the lively squares were filled with the renewed energy of merchants and artisans. People drifted constantly between bookshops, printing houses, and small taverns, forming a living network of exchange. Here, curiosity was treated as a virtue, never something to restrain. The lecture rooms were simple spaces: a long wooden table placed near the light of a window, a few racks of drawings leaning against the walls, and mathematical instruments hanging quietly from wooden pegs. There was none of the grandeur of the Medici palaces, yet there was a kind of openness rare elsewhere. In that bright stillness, the ideas on mechanics and motion that Galileo had carried with him began to find their own rhythm clearer with each passing day. One project that helped stabilize his finances was the military compass, a multi-purpose instrument used for scaling measurement and artillery calculations. Many versions had existed before, yet Galileo refined it into something more practical and wrote detailed instructions for the buyers. It was not merely a way to earn a living. It reflected his belief that mathematics existed to describe and resolve the problems of the real world. Padua was also where he taught hundreds of students each year. Accounts describe his classes as lively, direct, and richly conversational, a rarity in cities still dominated by scholastic tradition. Discussion spilled from the lecture halls into the small taverns near the city gates, where students debated geometry, military engineering, and the topics stirring scholars across Europe. Venice was close by, and its proximity made Padua a crossroads for new scientific texts. Translations of Archimedes, works on optics by Arab scholars, and technical notes from engineers of the Veneto passed through the city before spreading to the rest of Italy. For Galileo, this flow of knowledge was a kind of oxygen, especially as he worked to expand his experimental and mathematical approach. Many nights, Padua settled into a warm, amber glow under the oil lamps lining the university corridors. The city held a quiet all its own enough to make measurement sketches and numbers appear sharper in the unhurried light. During these long hours, Galileo continued shaping his ideas on uniform motion acceleration and inertia, concepts that would surface more fully in later manuscripts, traces of a patient, relentless labor. By the late 1590s, his reputation had grown noticeably. More students sought his lectures. Some described his teaching as experimental, a new word at the time signifying an approach grounded in measurement and demonstration rather than repetition of classical theory. In Padua, where science and practical craft met naturally, this method flourished. Beyond the classroom, the interplay of art and science in the Veneto shaped his understanding of geometry. Bridge builders, architects designing theaters, artisans crafting models, all drew from the same mathematical foundations he explored. In Padua, this connection appeared as a kind of backbone of society. Knowledge did not sit quietly in books. It lived in wood, stone, metal, and the bridges that arched over the rivers. His 8 years in Padua were not merely a teaching period. They were formative. A young man had arrived from Pisa with an uncertain future. He left Padua not only with stature, but with a system of thought, a way of seeing the world through measure, through motion, through law. Late on a winter day, the afternoon light rested on the red rooftops of Padua, its colors shifting by the minute. Under that light, the classrooms grew quiet, leaving only a few drawings on the walls. Straight lines and curved arcs that once revealed seemed to hint at a coming step Galileo could not yet name. And from these silent corridors, a new invention was about to open the sky in a way no one had imagined. Chapter 7. Nights of Measurement and the Rhythm of the World. Evening in Padua arrived with remarkable softness. The last light of day withdrew from the rooftops, leaving a gentle gold along the whitewashed corridors. Once the students had left the lecture halls, the city grew so quiet that each footstep echoed like a heartbeat of time. In that stillness, Galileo entered a period of work more steady than any before it. A season in which the world expanded not through debate, but through small trials repeated again and again. The early years of the 17th century marked the ripening of his thought. No longer surrounded by the restlessness of Florence or the intellectual collisions of Pisa-Padua, granted him something rare. A pace slow enough for him to grasp the subtlety of motion. His experiments were simple. An inclined plane, a suspended cord, a weight. Yet the attention he gave to the faintest change opened an entirely new depth in his sense of nature. Here time did not flow in a stream. It arrived in segments. Galileo placed a weight upon the incline, watched the delay between two markers, then tried again at a different angle. He did not chase numbers for their own sake. What mattered was how they shifted from trial to trial. The method taking shape in him grew unmistakable. Measure, compare, adjust. Listen to what seemed like the slow breathing of nature. During these years, his personal life also settled into a different cadence. As his teaching became steadier, Galileo formed a lasting bond with Maria Gamba, a woman from Venice. They did not marry, but 3 children were born in the Padua years, Virginia Livia and Vincenzo. Raising them outside marriage was delicate at the time. Yet their presence added another layer to his days. Journeys between Padua and Venice. Expenses for the children. The quiet unease of balancing family needs with scholarly work that offered little financial security. Padua's nights therefore moved in 2 rhythms. One for family, one for work. Though no documents map their alternation, the setting makes it easy to imagine Galileo caught between responsibility and intellect. Between caring for his children and pursuing the laws of motion that had followed him since Pisa. Late 16th century Padua was also a place where academic debates stretched into the evening. In small squares near the university, students and scholars argued their way through mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Each carried a conviction about the route knowledge should take. In these conversations, Galileo discovered that asking a question did not always produce opposition. Sometimes it simply opened another layer of understanding. This atmosphere strengthened his commitment to measurement and comparison. A slow path, but one capable of holding the essence of truth. In autumn, the city often wore a thin wash of light that deepened the color of the bricks. On such days, Galileo sometimes stood in the corridor overlooking a square, not to watch the passers-by, but to sense the repetition of time. Footsteps, voices the steady rhythm of movement. These quiet motions affirmed something he had long believed. The world carried a rhythm of its own, slow and even, perceptible only to those who stood still long enough to hear it. That feeling sustained his patience with simple measurements, for beneath them always lay a deeper order. And then, amid the slow pulse of ordinary days, a distant brightness made Europe pause. In 1604, a new star appeared in the sky, shining with a clarity that shook old beliefs. For centuries, people had held that everything beyond the moon's orbit was unchanging. But this light, brilliant, undeniable, told another story. Galileo lectured on it, not to refute Aristotle outright, but to show that nature had a history of its own, and that observation could rise above tradition. From his small measurements on the ground, he began to glimpse their connection to the heavens above. The years 1600 to 1604 were not an age of sudden revelation, but a period in which ideas quietly solidified. Galileo did not rush to claim or conclude. He widened each small piece through repetition. Many scholars of the time found him cautious, but this slow rhythm laid the groundwork for what would come. Padua at night was profoundly still. When a thin mist fell across the square, even the faint vibration of a suspended cord could be heard. In moments like these, it is easy to understand why Galileo believed every motion could be measured if one had the patience to wait for it to reveal itself. And in that silence, a new idea formed, a direction that would lift him from the very ground he measured and guide his first telescope toward the sky. Chapter 8. The first telescope turned toward the sky. On Galileo's table lay a small cylindrical tube of dark wood. Inside it, two lenses rested in an arrangement not yet perfect, yet sufficient to gather light in a new way. At first it was nothing more than a replica of an instrument from the north, something Dutch merchants carried aboard their ships to see farther across the sea. But for Galileo, it opened another door, not to enlarge the world before him, but to look at it with a different question. Rumors of the far-seeing tube reached Venice early in 1609. A simple device, though effective enough that the Venetian authorities sought immediate rights to it. Galileo heard its description in a brief conversation in Padua. Two lenses, a measured distance between them, a magnified image. That was all. Yet it stirred a chain of thought in him. If a lens could alter how the human eye saw the earth, could it not do the same for the sky? He began to experiment. There were no complete designs. only optical intuition and the practical skill those Padua years had honed in him. He reground the lenses, adjusted their spacing, and tried again and again until the image sharpened. The lenses themselves were not rare materials. It was the precision he invested in them that gave them a different character, one capable of touching the limits of human sight. In the days that followed, he continued refining the instrument with the patience Padua had quietly trained into him. The raw glass was difficult to shape. Each round of grinding left small imperfections, creating faint halos when he tested the view from his window. Yet these flaws became guides, helping him understand more clearly how light shifted through matter. That meticulousness set his final instrument apart, not in appearance, but in its ability to turn the sky into something measurable, comparable, answerable to reason. When the first telescope was completed, he tried it by daylight, rooftops, bell towers, boats gliding along the canals. The magnified images wavered slightly, distorted slightly, but they were clearer than anything built before. There was no spectacle, no unveiling ceremony, only a pale afternoon in which he understood that this instrument needed to be lifted towards something higher. And then one night Galileo pointed the tube upward. Light passed through the lenses as though through a newly opened gate. For him, it was not a moment of exclamation, but of silence. A recognition quietly shifting shape. The moon, most familiar of all celestial bodies, appeared no longer smooth as Aristotle's texts had claimed. Its surface revealed mountain ranges, shadowed ravines, alternating fields of light and dark, like the terrain of the earth itself. Old ideas did not crumble instantly. They simply opened a crack. And through that narrow opening, another world began to pour in. During the nights that followed, he turned the telescope toward the pale band of the Milky Way, no longer a gentle mist, as earlier centuries had described it, dissolved into countless points, each one a star. The heavens, long believed immutable, became a layered structure with density and depth. Everything felt nearer, as if the sky itself had stepped forward to meet him. His notes from 1609 show a familiar restraint. No flourish, no expression of wonder, only short lines about position, brightness, and form. Yet behind that quietness, one can sense a movement within him, the movement of a mind enlarging its own edges. Not every detail became a conclusion, but each small entry helped weave a new language of observation. A language in which the sky was no longer an emblem carved into books, but a presence that could respond when examined in the right way. On those nights, the distance between Padua and the vault of heaven seemed to contract, as though the telescope had placed Galileo in a new vantage closer to the true structure of the universe. Venice invited him to demonstrate the instrument. Members of the Council of Ten peered through the lens and saw rooftops and remote ships rendered with such clarity that they struggled to contain their astonishment. To them it was a military and maritime tool. To Galileo, it was only half the story. This modest telescope opened a new space for science and a new trajectory for his own life. As Padua's nights grew clearer, Moonlight returned to the room where Galileo kept his lenses, and in that quiet glow, he sensed that the observations ahead would reach farther than the unaided eye had ever dreamed. The telescope did not merely magnify images. It magnified the questions the world had yet to answer. Chapter 9. A messenger from the darkness of the universe. In 1610, Europe entered a moment when the sky was no longer only a religious symbol or a set of lines in ancient manuscripts. Astronomical records were beginning to speak with the voice of measurement and direct observation. Within that shift, Galileo perfected his finest telescope and stepped into a series of nights that would alter the way humanity imagined the universe. Padua remained as quiet as ever. Yet in the small room where Galileo worked, his measurements led him to a discovery no one had foreseen. Near Jupiter, he saw 4 small points of light. He tracked them night after night. They did not remain fixed. They moved, shifted, circled, as though turning around a center, not their own. Across the pages of his early 1610 notes, he marked their positions with steady regularity. From those shifting marks, a new image emerged. Celestial bodies could orbit a center other than Earth. The idea was not unheard of, but this was the first time it had been seen with human eyes and recorded through an instrument anyone could in principle test for themselves. The observation was not merely scientific. It rearranged a universe long believed to be settled. Then came the Milky Way. Through the new telescope, Galileo saw it not as a hazy stripe, but as a congregation of innumerable stars. What had once seemed a thin brightness unfolded into a vast structure stretching outward like a domain without count. The notion of an immutable sky began to change in hue, not through argument, but through light carried straight into the eye. He gathered these observations into a small manuscript, so brief no one could have guessed the impact it would have. Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger. In it, Galileo used no forceful declarations. He simply described what he had seen and drew conclusions from position, brightness, and form. Yet that simplicity gave the work an unusual weight. It demanded no belief. It opened a way for readers to look with their own eyes. When the booklet was printed in Venice in March 16, the news spread quickly. Scholars from Prague, Paris, and London all requested copies. Some debated, some doubted, but all looked to the sky with a question different from before. Not because Galileo had changed the universe, but because he had placed in others' hands a tool with which to verify it. Outside these nights of observation, the small house where Galileo lived with his 3 children kept its own rhythm. Evening oil lamps, a few loose pages on the table, the quiet shift of household objects. These minor details formed a stillness that contrasted sharply with the widening reach of the Starry Messenger. As his reputation traveled home remained an anchor keeping the sky above from separating too far from the familiar ground below. At the same time, the Medici, the ruling family of Florence, recognized the symbolic power of his discovery. The 4 satellites orbiting Jupiter were named by Galileo the Medicean stars, a gesture toward his homeland's court. They invited him back to Florence not just as a scholar, but as someone who could raise the scientific stature of the state. The invitation marked a turning point. Padua had given Galileo a place to think and to test. Florence would place him in a different setting, where fame carried responsibilities and where science walked side by side with politics. As word spread, young scholars traveled to Padua simply to look through his telescope. Some asked to see unfinished sketches. Others wanted to know why 4 small points of light could shift the entire order of the cosmos. These visits made clear how far his path had moved from a solitary workroom and how near his departure for Florence had become. Yet before leaving Padua, Galileo gave one more night to Jupiter. This time the 4 satellites appeared so sharply that he could draw them before the light had even faded from the sky. There was no exclamation in his notes, only position and time. That restraint was his signature. The sky never spoke loudly, yet it changed him and countless others through the faintest of lights. In the spring of 1610, he left Padua for Florence. From that moment, observing the heavens was no longer a private act on quiet nights. It became part of a larger conversation in which every discovery carried consequences beyond the walls of a small room. Siderius Nuncius closed the first journey of the telescope. The sky, broader now, layered, and deep, had only begun to open, as though light had found a longer road to travel. Chapter 10. Florence and the Price of Fame. In the summer of 1610, the road from Padua to Florence stretched through Tuscan valleys, entering a new season. Red rooftops, stone walls, and the olive tones of open fields emerged beneath the familiar morning haze of central Italy. At the end of that road, Galileo returned home not as a young lecturer seeking a place to stand, but as the man who had opened a new window onto the universe. The Medici received him with a degree of ceremony rarely granted to an independent scholar. Early 17th century Florence was more than a center of art. It was a place where politics, knowledge, and symbolism braided together. A discovery, even one drawn from the heavens, could be transformed into the prestige of a ruling house. Galileo was appointed philosopher and mathematician to the Grand Duke, a title that freed him from teaching obligations while giving him status and a secure income. It lifted the persistent financial anxieties that had followed him through the Padua years. Yet that freedom was fragile. In Florence, every word, every page, every argument could slip into a political context far larger than the small workroom he had left behind. In his first months, he kept to the steady rhythm of study. He improved his telescope, observed the sun, traced the drifting sunspots, and drew them with a restraint that belied their significance. He knew these observations would challenge the classical claim that the sun was perfect and unchanging. But for the moment, his notes remained within the quiet boundaries of private inquiry. Beyond that circle of study, Florence pulsed with its own cadence. Church bells, crowds, moving through narrow streets, and audiences at the Medici court. Life there gradually reshaped his days. Scholars, diplomats, and clerics all sought his thoughts on what was unfolding in the sky. Each conversation, however small, carried the potential to pull him toward debates he had not intended to enter. His relationship with Jesuit scholars began warmly. Schreiner Clavius and others regarded Galileo as a figure who had opened a new path of observation. They exchanged letters, drawings, and notes. Their earliest correspondence carried tones of respect and curiosity, a rare moment in which science and religion seemed to face the same direction. But the harmony did not last. When Galileo insisted that sunspots lay on the sun's surface and that their changing forms proved the sun imperfect, the distance between him and the Aristotelian tradition grew visible, not through open confrontation, but through gentle questions. In letters, doubts that widened around the interpretation of solar change. Meanwhile, his family life in Florence shifted quietly. His daughters, Virginia and Livia, were nearing the age at which many daughters of learned but modest households entered convents, especially when dowries were difficult to provide. His son Vincenzo continued to rely on his support. These obligations required Galileo to balance rising fame with the unchanging realities of family. By now, his arguments about motion had taken a more definite shape, edging toward the abstract descriptions Newton would later build into classical mechanics. His blend of observation, measurement, and mathematical reasoning became a signature of European scientific thought in these years. His relationship with Schreiner over the sunspots began to strain in 1611. Both men studied the same phenomenon, but interpreted it differently. Schreiner believed the spots were small bodies circling the sun. Galileo, noting their distortions across a full cycle, argued they lay upon the sun itself evidence of its imperfection. The debate reached beyond physics. It touched the larger question of the nature of the heavens, and thus neared the sensitive terrain of belief. When Galileo was invited to Rome to present his observations, the first meetings with Jesuit scholars still carried an air of respect. They admired his skill and the clarity with which he used observation to extend proof. Galileo, in later letters, acknowledged their goodwill. Yet beneath those conversations, two currents were pulling apart. On one side stood the Aristotelian heritage. On the other hand, the ascent of a new method. Galileo, though reluctant to confront either, found himself standing precisely at the boundary between them. By 1611 and 1612, he began to feel the weight of his expanding reputation. He understood that his position in Florence granted him influence, but also required him to speak plainly in an era when ideas could travel far beyond their author's intent. Florence, with its stone corridors and echoes of courtly life, made this responsibility clearer than Padua ever had. During these same years, Galileo continued to refine his telescope's crafting models with greater magnification and sending them as diplomatic gifts to courts across Europe. In the hands of princes, ambassadors, and academicians, the instruments became emblems of knowledge in motion, and at the same time, they placed his name within conversations that did not always belong to science. By the end of 1612, Galileo stood between two forces. One pulled him toward the skies. He longed to keep exploring. The other drew him into the tightening coils of politics, religion, and the reverberations of fame. And in Florence, the city he called home, Galileo sensed that the path before him would no longer resemble the quiet stone steps of Padua. A new era lay ahead, where the light of knowledge and the shadow of expectation could no longer be separated. Whatever the setting, the telescope still rose toward the sky, and each time he looked through it, the distant light drew him closer to a realm of debate already waiting for him. Chapter 11. The Letters That Shook Doctrine. In the early 1610s, Europe was moving through a slow but deep transformation. New maps appeared, voyages reached farther than ever before, and telescopic observations began to redraw heavens that generations had believed immutable. During these same years in Florence, Galileo found himself at the center of a question larger than his own life. What could science say about the world, and where must religious faith stand when new phenomena kept breaking the surface? In 1613, a small moment in daily life became the spark of a debate that would stretch across years. Benedetto Castelli, Galileo's student, dined at the home of a Medici noblewoman. When the conversation touched on Jupiter's satellites, the table turned suddenly toward the place of Earth in the cosmos, and whether Scripture truly rejected the Copernican model. Castelli recounted the evening to Galileo in a letter. Galileo answered with a long reply, gentle in tone, yet clear enough to open a different line of thought. Scripture, he wrote, was not written to explain the physical motions of the world. Sacred texts could adopt a common language while nature followed laws that could be measured. This idea was not new, but Galileo expressed it with a clarity unfamiliar to his age. He confronted no one. He simply suggested that two ways of understanding the world could coexist if each was read for its intended purpose. News of the letter traveled faster than expected. Florence and Rome were connected by thick networks of correspondence among cleric scholars and powerful families. A single paragraph could travel far, and in a world where philosophical claims could brush against the foundations of belief, such travel always carried consequences. In 1614, a Florentine friar, Tommaso Caccini, delivered a sermon attacking the Copernican view and naming Galileo as one who disturbed the traditional structure of natural philosophy. It was not a full assault, but it signaled a shift in the air around Galileo. Meanwhile, his life in Florence kept its dual rhythm. One beat for observation, one beat for audiences' letters and exchanges the Medici expected. Galileo continued tracking sunspots, comparing their paths, and refining his argument that their shifting shapes proved they lay on the sun's surface. It was a direct challenge to the old belief that celestial bodies were pure and unchanging. His notes from this period carry a steady voice, not meant to provoke, only to describe. Yet in that era, a correct description could be a powerful act. In letters to his friends, Galileo sometimes wrote of his desire to move science out of the blurred space between philosophy and doctrine. He believed natural phenomena must be read in their own language, measurement, motion number. From Padua to Florence, from telescope to sketches of the sun, his method did not waver. Observe first, conclude later. In 1615, Galileo wrote a letter to Grand Duchess Christina, a text that would become a landmark in the history of the dialogue between science and faith. In it, He explained that Scripture was not written to teach astronomy, and thus should not be used to describe the motions of the heavens. He argued that when sacred texts seem to differ from observational results, readers must distinguish the aims of each source. Religious writings guided the life of the spirit. Nature revealed itself through laws that could be measured. Nature, he wrote, did not bend to human wishes or interpretations. It moved according to stable principles that patient observers could discern. His tone stayed calm, but the force of the reasoning made the letter a central document in the unfolding debate. Rome followed these developments closely. The Jesuit scholars maintained good relations with Galileo, but caution grew. Scheiner and others continued corresponding with him about solar observations. Yet their reports also flowed upward through ecclesiastical channels. Scientific debate was beginning to collide with the duty to preserve doctrine, and Galileo stood at the intersection. By 1616, the Holy Office examined the Copernican question. The conclusion, the motion of Earth, was contrary to Scripture, when read literally. Galileo was not condemned, but he was instructed not to teach or defend Copernicus as the truth. This was not a sentence yet. It drew a boundary he could not ignore. From then on, every observation, every statement, every manuscript existed within a space under watch. And still, his work did not pause. Galileo continued measuring, noting, and comparing new data with older trials. In Florence, he spent mornings by the window, observing light on the wall, tracking subtle changes in the shapes of sunspots as they crossed the solar surface. That repeated rhythm, slow, steady, patient, linked Padua's early telescope nights to Florence's expanding arena of debate. Looking back, these 3 years shaped the road ahead. From a quiet observer of the heavens, he became a man pressed between two currents of thought. One held to the old order. The other sought to widen the world through measure and reason. He did not declare allegiance to either side. He simply followed his method. And that method in its own way chose his position for him. As Florence sank into winter afternoons of pale gold, Galileo understood that his next step would not be a purely scientific one. A larger conversation was approaching between two readings of the universe, between two voices of the age. The letters of these years were only ink and paper, yet they opened boundaries that would not close again. And from them, the question Galileo once posed to Christina began to grow. How must nature be heard? And that question was already drawing him toward Rome. Chapter 12. The Man Who Measured the World with Light and Number. One afternoon in 1619, while Galileo was lecturing to a small circle of trusted students in Florence, a young man brought him Orazio Grassi's new treatise on comets. It was a thin manuscript, written with confidence, arguing that comets were celestial bodies moving far beyond the moon's orbit. The student meant no provocation. He simply thought Galileo would be interested. Yet that small encounter opened a chain of exchanges that would become one of the great debates over scientific method in the early 17th century. The comets of 1618 had appeared across Europe, drawing long, pale strokes across the winter sky. Grassi, a Jesuit scholar, with considerable astronomical expertise, described their motion using geometric observations. Their orderly paths, he argued, proved that they lay at great distance, not atmospheric illusions, as many still believed. Galileo read the manuscript in the familiar space of Florence, surrounded by his notes on motion sketches of lenses and the intertwined responsibilities of court life. He admired Grassi's skillful handling of data, yet he could not accept the claim that cometary orbits were fixed and could be determined from angular observations alone. The evidence, he believed, was not yet sufficient. More measurement was needed, more caution in reasoning. Scientific debates of the time did not unfold in lecture halls. They unfolded in letters and slim printed pamphlets carried quickly between cities. So did the Galileo-Grassi dispute. From a quiet afternoon, it grew into a full conversation about method. Should truth be demonstrated through measurement or through geometric reasoning? Should inquiry begin with phenomena or with models? In Il Saggiatore, the Assayer, published in 1623, Galileo replied in prose shaped by the philosophy of a new method. He wrote that nature could not be read by intuition or authority, but must be read by mathematics. Philosophy is written in the language of numbers of lines and of circles. A sentence that would later become an emblem of the methodological revolution. Yet the most striking element was Galileo's tone. Unhurried, unwavering, infused with faith in the order of nature. He did not overturn Grassi through personal argument. He offered instead a way of reading the world that anyone could test by measurement. The work was not merely a disputation. It drew a boundary between two eras, one anchored in Aristotle authority and intuition. One emerges through data experiment and mathematics. During these same years, Florence remained a city of soft footsteps in stone corridors, court audiences, and visits from scholars across Europe. Galileo had to balance political expectations with research telescope demonstrations with the quiet hours needed for writing. From 1619 to 1623, he no longer worked at the pace of his Padua years. But his thinking grew sharper, clearer. These were years of refinement. Not years of inventing new instruments, but of securing the method. If Padua had been the period in which he studied the world through hands and rolling spheres, Florence became the place where he measured it with light and number. Family life formed a quiet foundation beneath these years. His daughters, Virginia and Livia, had entered the convent of San Matteo near Arcetri. He wrote to them, supported them, the small exchanges revealing a side of Galileo not found in scientific manuscripts, steady, quiet, intimate. He continued shaping a path for his son Vincenzo as well, a responsibility that fame could not lighten. In the evenings of Florence, Galileo often worked by lamplight, reading his notes, checking each number. No longer standing in Padua's squares, watching the city's rhythms, he drew closer to his desk, letting the narrow glow guide him. That manner of working gave Il Saggiatore its distinctive voice, measured, patient, bright as the observations that grounded it. The dispute with Grassi spread across Europe. Some leaned toward the Jesuit tradition of geometric deduction. Others began to see the power of putting observation before theory. Il Saggiatore did not settle the question of comets, but it accomplished something larger. It repositioned the center of science. When Maffeo Barberini, later Pope Urban VIII, wrote to praise the work, it showed that the new method was not always in opposition to the Church. At that moment in Rome's highest intellectual circles, Galileo was still regarded as an esteemed interlocutor, a trusted mind. Yet even within those friendly voices, history was preparing its next turn. When Urban VIII ascended the papal throne in 1623, Galileo believed he had found a safe space from which to speak of Copernicus with reason and restraint. Their meetings were marked by mutual respect. Urban VIII had once written poetry in Galileo's honor and considered him one of the age's finest minds. In that light, a new hope emerged that Galileo might write a major work, not to provoke but to converse between two cosmic models. But between hope and reality lies a thin interval where misunderstanding can grow swiftly. As Galileo closed the final pages of Il Saggiatore, Florence was settling into the soft quiet of winter. From his window he watched light fall across the rooftops, forming slow bands of color he had observed since his early Padua days. In those drifting lines, he felt he had touched a firmer layer of knowledge. The world could be measured by light, by number, by patience. What he did not yet know was that Il Saggiatore was only the prologue to a larger dialogue, one that would unfold not between two scholars, but between two visions of the universe. And that dialogue would lead him to the greatest work of his life. Chapter 13. A dialogue between two universes, pulling apart. The early 1620s opened a new rhythm in Galileo's intellectual life. No longer defined by Padua's quiet nights or the steady cadence of teaching, he stepped into a period in which ideas, relationships, and history itself began to intersect in unpredictable ways. From Florence to Rome, from private conversations to formal audiences, every subtle shift of these years helped shape the trajectory Europe's science would follow. Within that unfolding current, Galileo returned to Rome not as a scholar seeking recognition, but as the bearer of a method already spreading across the continent. Urban VIII had just ascended the papal throne. For years prior, Maffeo Barberini and Galileo had exchanged letters steeped in mutual admiration. Barberini had written poetry praising Galileo, viewing him as one of the boldest voices of the new science. Their closeness created a cautious hope. Perhaps in Rome, Galileo might find space to discuss Copernicus in a measured, reasonable way. Rome in these years was a crossroads of two intellectual worlds. One remained anchored in a classical cosmos preserved through centuries of teaching. The other was widening, seeking to measure nature with newly invented instruments. In discussions among clerics and scholars invited by the Vatican people spoke of telescopes, comets, sunspots, phenomena no longer possible to dismiss. During these meetings, Galileo presented his method. Repeated observation, numerical record, no appeal to the authority of any text beyond nature itself. Urban VIII listened intently. He did not reject Copernicus outright. He simply insisted that if the model were to be discussed, it must be discussed as a mathematical hypothesis, never as an absolute truth. Those days moved within an atmosphere both respectful and cautious. Galileo understood that even with papal favor, no path was entirely safe. He returned to Florence carrying the sense that he had opened a door and the awareness that a single misstep might cause it to close. Over the next 8 years, he began shaping a new book, the work that would later be known as the Dialogue. His aim was not to force a choice, but to place two understandings of the universe in conversation. On one side, the Ptolemaic Aristotelian world. On the other hand, the Copernican. He chose a three-voice dialogue to present the arguments without asserting them from a single authoritative narrator. The dialogue was written in Italian rather than Latin, a deliberate break from academic convention. The choice widened the audience and signaled his desire to bring science closer to common life, to keep it from remaining confined within scholastic walls. During these writing years, he visited Arcetri more often to see his 2 daughters and to find the quiet necessary for thought. His visits unfolded along soft stone steps in the monastery tucked among trees and the angled light of the Florentine hills. Letters from Virginia arrived regularly, gentle and steady, often noting his health. These details did not alter the history of science, but they formed the human undertone of a tension-filled period. As Galileo wrote, Europe shifted. The 30 Years' War was reshaping the balance of power, and religious disputes grew increasingly sensitive. A book about the structure of the cosmos, however scientific, could not remain untouched by that climate. In 1629, Galileo completed the manuscript. He sent it to Rome for approval. At first, all went smoothly. Censors agreed to allow publication, so long as the opening stated clearly that the Copernican model was being discussed as a hypothesis. Galileo accepted. But as the printed pages were reviewed, some passages appeared stronger in tone than expected, prompting renewed caution in Rome. When the dialogue was published in 1632, it spread faster than the starry messenger. Its clarity, its vivid imagery, and the ease with which readers could follow its arguments made it one of the most discussed works in Italy and beyond. Readers felt they were stepping into a real conversation, guided by reason rather than decree. But that very quality created its own danger. The character representing the traditional worldview, Simplicio, seemed to some readers overly rigid, overly defensive. In Rome, certain voices claimed that Simplicio's reasoning resembled arguments Urban VIII had once shared with Galileo. Though unintended, this was interpreted as veiled criticism. Reception shifted. The book became the center of a tightening debate. The printer was ordered to halt distribution. Copies were examined. Letters were sent to Florence to clarify the author's intent. In late 1632, Galileo's correspondence remained calm. He explained that the book sought only to present 2 lines of reasoning in a fair exchange. Copernican arguments seemed stronger simply because their mathematical structure was stronger. That was not political intent. It was the nature of logic. But the moment had changed. Religious and political tensions across Europe required the Vatican to act with heightened caution. A book on the structure of the universe could no longer be treated as mere science. Early in 1633, Galileo received an order to appear in Rome. Florence's winter light lay thin across the rooftops, and within that quiet glow, Galileo prepared his journey. This was not a trip to demonstrate a telescope, not a trip for scholarly exchange. It was a meeting between two visions of the world, and this time the space between them was no wider than a courtroom. When Galileo left Florence, the telescope remained in his study, silent as though waiting for someone else to look through it. And he stepped into a journey no measurement of his own could predict. A journey toward the place that would decide the fate of a book and of the man who wrote it. Chapter 14. The day he had to step back from the light. The road from Florence to Rome lay under the muted gray of an Italian winter. The cold sharpened the sound of hooves carrying it farther across the valleys, while monasteries stood out in the thin morning mist. On that journey, Galileo, now nearly 70, was no longer the young man who once walked from Padua back to Florence. He was a scholar renowned across Europe, yet he now traveled under a summons from the Inquisition. The preceding years had been tense. Dialogue, published in 1632, had been written with the hope of helping the public understand two cosmic systems, the old and the new, through an open conversational form. But in the political and religious climate of the time, ideas seldom stayed within their intended boundaries. Some felt the book placed Copernicus in too favorable a position. Others thought Simplicio, the spokesman for the old view, had been portrayed as too weak. Together, these impressions carried the book far beyond what Galileo had imagined. When news reached Rome, many Jesuit scholars felt uneasy. They had respected Galileo, discussed theory, and exchanged observations of the heavens with him. But by this moment, the issue was no longer scientific. It had touched the border between scriptural interpretation and the new cosmic model. In an age when sacred texts define the very framework of the world, anything brushing against that boundary became weighty and dangerous. The journey to Rome was not long yet. For an elderly man, it was surely difficult. Records indicate that Galileo was treated civilly and housed comfortably, not imprisoned. Church officials conducted themselves with the decorum tradition required. In early meetings, his voice was described as calm, no resistance, no confrontational tone. And yet behind that calm was something impossible to hide. Galileo knew he was now facing the full weight of his intellectual legacy. Rome no longer resembled the city he had known during earlier scholarly visits. By 1633, it carried a heavy caution, as though every conversation had to slow its pace. Jesuit astronomers continued their work. But the decrees concerning Copernicus, issued in the 1610s, cast a long shadow. Any discussion of Earth's place in the cosmos now required careful footing. The interrogations unfolded over many days, each session examining a different portion of the dialogue. According to surviving records, the questioning did not resemble a modern trial, but rather a series of clarifications. Had Galileo intentionally advocated the Copernican system? Had he violated the 1616 injunction? Had the dialogue overstepped the bounds of a merely hypothetical treatment? Galileo insisted that his purpose was to present two viewpoints, not to impose judgment. He pointed to the structure of the work, arguing that the dialogue form allowed readers to decide for themselves. But to the examiners, the narrative tone leaned unmistakably in one direction. No one raised their voice during these sessions. There was no drama, none of the sharp confrontations later legend would invent, only steady questions and an aging man, doing his best to keep his answers faithful to his text. Beyond the doors of the hearings, Rome continued its ordinary life-wide piazzas, church bells, and pilgrims passing through old streets. But for Galileo, those sounds must have carried a different timbre. For someone who had spent his life widening the heavens, the task of defending each sentence of his book surely pressed heavily. Records show that he often mentioned his failing health. He suffered from rheumatism. His vision was weakening. The windy nights of the city could not have been kind. Letters from friends reveal their fear that he might collapse before the proceedings ended. Yet he attended every session, not with defiance, but with the quiet persistence that had defined him since his Padua years. Some Roman scholars express sympathy. They did not deny his brilliance. But neither could they stand entirely outside the framework of their age. In a world where religious faith and intellectual structure were woven tightly together, no one could step fully outside the system. In June 1633, the decision came: Galileo was required to abjure the claim that the earth moves. The date is lived in memory, though the actual event was far quieter than posterity imagines. No fierce accusations, no dramatic outbursts. Only a document, a reading, and the acceptance of a man who knew his place within a larger historical frame. His punishment was not imprisonment, but house arrest. Some historians believe this reflected respect for his age and his scientific contributions. Whatever the reasons, the result was the same. Galileo would no longer freely walk into lecture halls or take part in the lively exchanges that had once filled his years in Padua and Florence. After the verdict, Galileo left Rome. The road home carried a different air. No hope of altering the outcome, yet not complete despair either. Many accounts describe in him a quiet steadiness, typical of those who have devoted their lives to knowledge, who understand that whatever circumstances shift, nature's questions remain. As he returned through the Tuscan countryside, the wind, moving through the olive fields, perhaps recalled for him his early days in Vallombrosa, or Padua's afternoons, filled with a faint sound of oscillating strings. Those moments would not return, but the method he used to listen to the world, patient, exact, unwavering, remained intact. In the summer months of 1633, the story closed not with the noise of controversy, but with the wind passing through the hills of Arcetri, where Galileo would spend the rest of his life. No longer standing in Rome's piazzas or Florence's lecture halls, he now faced a quiet room, a small table, and the sky still open above him. Even confined within four walls, the motions of the natural world did not stop, and Galileo would continue listening to them with whatever strength remained. Chapter 15. Arcetri, where the last ideas still kept moving. An old wooden table stood pressed against the window of the house in Arcetri. On it, pages lay stacked in uneven piles, their edges slightly curled from the night mist drifting down from the Florentine hills. Morning light slid across the paper, touching the faint lines of ink Galileo had written in the days just before leaving Rome. No lecture halls, no courtly audiences, only a small room where time lingered long enough for one man to continue the work of his life quietly, but never without motion. Arcetri in the 1630s possessed a stillness unlike any place Galileo had lived before. The gentle slopes, the olive groves, the vineyards stretched under the muted glow of afternoon light. Wind moved through the stone steps leading up to the convent of San Matteo, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and the distant ringing of bells. In this space, Galileo entered a phase in which every inward movement, intellectual, emotional, moral, grew lighter but deeper. After the 1633 trial, he was placed under house arrest first in Siena, then later allowed to move to Arcetri, near the convent where his daughters Virginia and Livia lived. Ironically, the decision made by the Church placed him in a setting gentler than Florence, quieter than Rome, and steady enough for uninterrupted work away from the noise of politics and argument. In the early days at Arcetri, he kept his old habits, rising early, opening the window, letting the morning light enter the room. But the air here held its own rhythm, slow, soft, and touched with something ancient. The only sounds were the rustle of dry leaves and the monastery bells, low and steady, as if quietly reminding him that the world carried on even if he no longer walked the wide corridors of Florence or Rome. His relationship with his children deepened in these years. Virginia, now Sister Maria Celeste, wrote to him often. Her letters were gentle, warm, deeply attentive. She asked about his health, urged him to keep warm, and sometimes sent small gifts, herbs, bread, fruit. These letters, preserved today, form one of the most moving records of Galileo's final years. Not because they speak of science, but because they reveal a softer dimension of his life. A father carrying a quiet tenderness. Meanwhile, the work continued. In the small room at Arcetri, Galileo began writing 2 new sciences. His final work, the culmination of more than 40 years studying motion. There were no new telescopes, no nights under the great sky. He returned instead to the mechanical questions that had followed him since Padua: acceleration, uniform motion, the strength of materials. Ideas once interrupted by the trial now returned, but with a deeper tone, like echoes from a time when light and shadow had never fully parted. But his eyesight declined rapidly. He wrote that light had become dim and clouded, as though the world had slipped behind a thick veil. By 1638, he was completely blind. Even so, the flow of his reasoning did not stop. Former students Viviani and Torricelli traveled to Arcetri to write down what he dictated. They became small bridges, linking Galileo to the intellectual world, still moving beyond the limits of his confinement. Arcetri was not isolated. Scientists across Europe continued to send letters asking for his thoughts on oscillation, projectile motion, and the laws of falling bodies. Younger thinkers saw him as the founder of a new way of reasoning. Through this correspondence, Galileo understood that though fame had forced him into silence before the Church, his work moved forward by another path, quieter but far-reaching. In 1634, Maria Celeste died at the age of 33. It was one of Galileo's deepest losses, leaving a void that shaped the atmosphere of Arcetri. His health declined quickly afterward, and work became an anchor to keep his days from falling apart. In this muted period, the bond between father and daughter, preserved in the surviving letters, stands as one of the most enduring lights in his life. After her death, Galileo continued writing. Two new sciences slowly neared completion and were smuggled to the Netherlands, where publishing was freer. In 1638, it appeared in print and immediately became a foundational work of physics. Newton would later write, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Galileo was among the giants who built the ground beneath those shoulders. In his final years, Galileo spent long hours sitting by the window. Not to study the heavens, he could no longer see them, but to feel the light. Light had become not a tool of observation, but a form of memory. Padua's nights, the moons of Jupiter, the bright mornings of Florence, all condensed into a private luminosity that required no eyes. Arcetri continued its steady rhythm. The monastery bells rang, the wind brushed across the tiles. And inside the small house, a mind that had once shaken Europe's understanding of the universe worked only by voice and by hands resting on a wooden table. On January 8th, 1642, Galileo died in this house. There was no noise, no upheaval, only the slow turning of time, like the motions he had spent a lifetime trying to understand. That quiet morning, a thin band of light still lay across the wooden table, as if his ideas had not left, but had changed into another kind of motion, lighter, steadier, no longer dependent on the eyes of the observer. He left the world believing that time would someday understand him. But time makes no promises to anyone. His life began in narrow rooms where the rustle of paper and the glow of lamplight were the whole world. It passed through years of brilliance when a small telescope or a thin manuscript could reshape a dynasty, when an idea could widen the sky for generations. And it ended in a quiet house on a hill, where darkness slowly covered his eyes, but not his mind. Today his legacy does not live in heated controversies, but in the way we see the world, in every physics classroom, in every star map, in every question we dare to ask, even when it was once forbidden. What he left behind was not certainty, but a method, a way of entering nature with patient doubt and unwavering persistence. And we must still ask ourselves, do we truly understand the consequences of what we discover? Are we following the path he opened, or repeating the very circles of hesitation he once faced? History does not answer. It only lays the questions down and walks away. So now, as the candlelight of this story begins to thin, let him remain where we found him, still seated at the wooden table, still writing, still measuring, still believing that in the vast shadows of the universe there is always one small point of light for those who wait long enough to see it. The rest is in our hands. Sleep well.